Thank you for staying in this room. I wanted to give you something slightly different. I wanted to actually share with you some of the difficulties that are experienced by some of our children in the classroom on a daily basis. And some of these difficulties are actually sensory difficulties, and they're actually hidden just like autism is hidden, so it's not actually, you're not able to actually see it. And it's these sensory difficulties that can prove problematic to students as well as teachers. Teachers, through no fault of their own, may find things quite difficult because of the lack of knowledge. And all too often the students themselves are actually probably unaware that the difficulties they have are actually different from neurotypical people. And very often they'll actually express these difficulties through no fault of theirs, but often as a behavioural to sensory stimuli, if you like. I think if I go through this one, which is unusual responses to sensory stimuli, they're not new. They were actually noticed in the beginning of the official history of autism. Both Kanner in 43 and Asperger in 44 describe bizarre reactions from their patients to such as like sound, touch, and the sense of smell, that kind of thing. So it's been around for a long time. My son did this one for us, and I wanted to actually let you experience, or to actually try and get you to experience what it's like to walk in our shoes. So the next slide, I actually want you to see in a classroom situation perhaps where a child is drawing a picture of an elephant or a cow or that kind of thing, a horse, and keeps producing that very same picture with, say, 5 or 6 legs. If that child has visual difficulties, it's highly likely that that's how he might perceive that elephant or whatever he's actually drawing to be. For instance, this next slide, is it this one? Yeah, it's come. How many legs has the elephant actually got? And it's just to prove, this is it's an Escher drawing. I like to use this one, especially in schools on inset days, because it actually makes people more aware. And it drives that point across about visual difficulties. And is what we actually see always what we actually do see? Because the next slide, although that's actually represents an elephant, it's actually a face painting but on a hand. So I want to take you through some of the difficulties that we experience on the next slide. Hypersensitive. So children can be hypersensitive or hyposensitive. They can actually be sensory seekers or sensory avoiders. People always say to me that that some children sit there doing this kind of thing over their eyes, and it's usually kind of light related, or they actually like the feeling of that. Sometimes they actually do that because of the proprioception difficulties that they have. They don't know where the ends of their fingers are in space, that kind of thing. But usually these kind of things are the kind of things to us in a teaching situation are to look out for, to give some indicators of possible hyposensitive difficulties that someone might be having at the time. The next slide is hypersensitive. People that don't like bright lights, people that don't like touch, they resist touch. People that find it really difficult to walk on uneven surfaces, like are in and around the playground area, that kind of thing. And people that, when they actually lift the feet to do any kind of activity, either in the gym or actually outside in play or at lunchtime, get really quite anxious and stressed if their feet are actually off the ground, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing that we're hypersensitivities, but we're going to go into it a little bit more on what areas it will actually affect a little bit. The next slide, the visual differences. I want to mention this one because it seems that it's actually our strongest sense, and children with ASD rely quite heavily on it. They use it a lot more than people actually do give them credit for, although it can actually be quite stressful for them. Very often, though, it's also overstimulated through bright lights, reflective objects and surfaces. And strategies here might be to include seating the child away from bright lights, both artificial and direct sunlight, and away from walls that are quite cluttered, that are overstimulating, that kind of thing. The next slide is the auditory differences. Most frequently, it's one of the most impaired senses. For people that are hyperacute or have hyperacute hearing, it can be agonizing pain. The transition between classes can be quite a difficult one as well, especially when the bell goes in the corridor. Metal on metal is not a very nice sound at all. Temple Grandin refers to metal-based type sounds. If I go in to see my son or about my son at school, I can become quite anxious about the actual bell going off. It's just an issue that I know it's a difficult one because they have bells in most schools anyway. But these kind of things can actually impact on learning. So sometimes if somebody tries to modulate or actually be in control of that by switching that sense off, if they're able to do that, what actually appears as laziness, because they're trying to shut one system down, it can actually be misconceived as being non-compliant, when in actual fact it's the child's inability to actually filter out sounds, ordinary sounds. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. There was one school where an individual he actually answered 40 questions to a 20-question test. And every other question was relevant to the classroom that he was in. But at the same time, he also actually heard 20 questions being asked 2 rooms away. So if you can imagine, if he can hear that, what kind of auditory difficulties is he experiencing in that particular room on an average day? So it's highly likely that at some stage, that individual, which he did, used to always have a sensory overload towards the last part of the day, because he's tried to keep it together, and obviously he's not successful because of the way it impairs on his senses. Lighting again can come into this one, because all too often people that have difficulties, especially with acute hearing, can actually hear the motors in the electric strips. So they're always kind of distracted. And it appears to teachers and learning support staff sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes if the individual is experiencing that they're too involved daydreaming or whatever, what they're actually trying to do is get away from listening to the light, but they're unable to do it because they don't know how to do it. And I think another strategy there would be try to be aware in a classroom situation of the seating, where people are actually placed, and try to have it a little bit more organised. The next slide. Yep. Tactile differences. Children with a sensitivity to touch might well respond to something that they don't actually like by way of a fight or flight response. Sometimes reacting with aggression, sometimes simply running away. Very often you hear parents mention about the children's uniforms sometimes have to have labels in to say, you know, obviously if they take the jumper off, the jumper gets lost. Clothing tags, though, with names can actually cause physical pain to some of the children. The label actually rubs, or that's what they appear to do. And their reaction to that still can be like an aggressive type one, or it just can be just a constant distraction. Children might evade haircuts, or even touch, or an embrace, that kind of thing. They might even avoid brushing the teeth, that kind of thing. Nail clippings. And even if you take it back into a school situation, tasks like hand painting or in the sand table, that might actually cause the child more stress than fun, especially to a child who's hypersensitive to touch. Some kids always say that they actually feel, where they're able, they actually say that they actually feel trapped in their own skin. And children with hypersensitivity to touch might not always register the experiences adequately because their other senses are kicking in as well, especially if they might be hypersensitive to sound and touch. So it's quite a difficult one because some kids can be hypersensitive when it comes to hearing. They can be hyposensitive when it comes to other things, or it can be a mix of all, or all and one or nothing. So it makes it a lot harder for people to actually appreciate and understand. There's hyposensitivity. I've put here that the brain might need for more development in that. Some kids don't always experience pain or even get dizzy if they've been on a roundabout or they've been spinning round. They don't do that kind of thing well. Instead of falling over, they actually sometimes they might seek it, or they might, if somebody falls over. I know one young lad who fell over, and he broke his leg. But all afternoon he was saying that he'd got a tummy ache because he couldn't associate the pain with his leg. It was associated with his tummy. So it's knowing where your senses, where they're actually kicking in. And that's difficult for some children. They don't actually feel pain the same as other people, which makes it even harder to understand. So from a perspective in a classroom situation, I would always ask, please, if somebody who's on the spectrum complains of tummy ache, is just to try and be the policeman and take that one a little bit further. The next one, olfactory differences. Most people I know that have difficulties in this area say that they, for instance, they might try and avoid a science class because of the smell, or a cooking class because they don't like the smell there. And especially if they're hyperacute. And smells, the smell one's actually quite a common thing with people in classroom situations, especially with autism. The next one, gustatory differences, where it's hyperacute sense to taste. And again, if you think about it, I mean, it's a skin thing. Your mouth is still skin, so it's a tactile thing as well. Sometimes parents refer to their children as being picky eaters. They might only have one or two pieces or types of food that they eat. Usually it's cereal. My son's 14. He goes through no end of, I'm not plugging here, but he goes through no end of Cheerios and milk, and he's quite cheap to keep, actually. Well, nearly quite cheap. It's cheaper than a hamster. But what I wanted to talk to you about also are the lesser known or lesser talked about senses. which are the vestibular and the proprioception senses. And the next one. The vestibular differences means the vestibular system it's where it regulates the sense of balance and stability, and children with difficulties in this area are actually very often aware of their own difficulties. They usually tend to try to avoid PE or tasks in and around that kind of subject area. They tend to be avoiders because they're actually aware of their own differences there. They know sometimes that they're clumsy, or if it's part of a task where they have to be part of a team, they always seem to be like the odd one out. They seem to be the one that lets that side down, and it's usually because of the difficulties that they've got. The next one is your proprioception difficulties. And this is the sense that actually brings all of the senses together. And it's kind of closely related to the vestibular sense, but it gives us an awareness of where our body is, or body position is in space. It allows us to manipulate objects, and it actually marries a few of the senses together, because when you actually look to make a cup of tea, you're looking, but you're using your hands, so you're marrying a few senses up. This is the proprioception where it kicks in, and it's the ability to actually interpret these messages and to work out where our things are in space. I mean, as I mentioned about children doing that kind of thing, it's because they do tend to do that, or they might tap their feet. Classroom situations where kids actually fall off the chair, or they're tapping their feet, and yes, they might be distracting the rest of the class, but there's actually a reason for that behaviour that's happening. Because I'm a firm believer in that when people say that, yeah, he's got behavioural difficulties, I think sometimes it's a case of if you understand the autism and the sensory difficulties that might come with it, then you'll understand that behaviour that challenges might come as a direct result if the previous two aren't actually understood. The next one is it's not actually well, there's a lot of people tend to be with it, but it's not right across the spectrum. But synesthesia has been reported by a fair few people tending to be higher functioners. Well, it could be the fact that they're more able to actually articulate. I mean, my website is called Colour 7, but in the title, the V is actually replaced with a numerical 7. It's an autistic play on things, because if you turn a 7 round, eventually it would possibly become a V. But that's in yellow, because I see yellow as a 7, A as red, and M kind of almost like a khaki green kind of colour. But when I see that, I can actually smell petrol. So what I wanted to do, I'm not like, I mean, Daniel Tammet, if anybody's heard of Daniel Tammet can recite pi to 22,514 places. But for each of those numbers, he has a colour, a shade, and a hue. And he can repeat that over and over again for all 22,500. So what I wanted to try to do was to give you the nearest possible thing I could do to experiencing what it's like to have synesthesia. So on the next slide, when I come on in a second, I want you to follow the leads. It's a big circle. It's made up of lots of different circles. But I actually want you to follow the lead circle. And then when I tell you to look at the middle, you'll be able to see that the lead circle changes colour. So I'll try that and see if it works. So if you follow the lead circle, and now try and focus on the black in the middle, can you see the lead change colour? Can I have a show of hands who can actually see that? I can't see past the first 2 rows of that. Yeah. And I've also done what parents usually ask teachers to do, which is to differentiate. So I've done this for people. The next one is for people with colour differences. So the same procedure again. You follow it round, and now look at the cross. It should go green. So can most people see that? It's quite interesting actually, because this forms part of a test for schizophrenia, so I've got quite a good audience. But joking apart, it's the nearest thing I can get, because the actual circles to me represent, in this exercise, actually represent print on a screen or on a piece of paper, let's say A4. And the lead one, when it's changed colour, is the actual synesthesia, how it jumps out off the page at you. So it's the nearest thing I can probably get to trying to get you to understand. So I suppose, how can teachers help? Well, I suppose, see, lots of people on the spectrum tend to like a semblance of order. We're not particularly good at change. So I would ask possibly if you could organise your furniture and equipment in such an order or in such a manner where you stick to that order. And remember that some kids with autism can actually bring on a sensory, the onset of a sensory overload, because they're so worked up about the change in the room. But the use of areas, for instance, like a play area, a reading area, and workspaces can help certain children distinguish between the types of behaviour that's actually required for those different types of work. So it's a lot more, maybe it's a bit more constructed, but it does help children with autism and other people with difficulties as well, for that matter. I think the label, if you label equipment areas and equipment quite readily, then it does make it a lot easier to understand. Then the next slide has actually got a video embedded, and I want you to please try and see if you can work out who's actually got autism and sensory difficulties. And the answer is? Does anybody know what the answer is? Okay, is there anybody out there? The answer is actually that everybody does. Because the purpose of that is really just to say that because it's autism, which is very often hidden, and sensory difficulties can also be hidden, most people forget that they associate disability with being something physically that they can see. I mean, if I had one leg and fell over, it'd be quite obvious that I had some kind of difficulty and someone might assist me. Yet people with autism fall over in here quite regular, but it's inside and it's hidden. And it's that message that I actually want to get across. And it's disability and not disobedience is what I'm trying to get across. The next video, well, the next slide actually is it's like as you move up, as you progress into senior school or into university, that kind of thing. It's always quite difficult to actually to actually get used to to changes. Because if we take this one, for instance, the next slide, it's in a situation when you've got when you have things like lectures, that kind of thing. You have to get from one place to another, and it's the visual difficulties that we have. There's well, it's not on now, is it? I'll just pop this on. Yeah. Have we had this one? Have we had it? Actually, we haven't. This is to prove a point, because if there are people with autism that are in the room, it's highly likely that they'd have probably seen the differences. Because if I go onto the next one, can you see the differences? And usually, the message I'm trying to get across here is that people with autism, very often, what happens is that they see those differences. They see those differences while other things are being asked, while the other tasks are being asked, and their senses get flooded with it. And it just makes it quite difficult for sometimes for people to understand. So that is a classic one, because you know, I've had instances where when I've spoken to kids, or I've heard from kids where they said, "Oh, that's a nice lady, she's got 13 buttons on her shirt." And you know, it's little things like that, and they've probably not noticed about the tasks that they've been asked, but they noticed the 13 buttons. And people say to me sometimes about people with autism, regardless of their ability, it seems to be this affinity that they have with numbers. And I think the answer to that really is that numbers are actually numbers are trusting. Numbers never change. People inadvertently are unpredictable, where numbers are always predictable. Does that make sense? I think on this next one, let me have a look. This one is how might we help in the class then? So we've said about planning the way that the room's planned out. Sometimes it might be an advantage, especially if you have if you know that you have someone in the classroom, or even parents for that matter, that where that the children have got visual difficulties, or they complain about bright lights, that kind of thing. It might be easier to, like what this lady, the teacher's doing here, which is to wear slightly dull clothing. I know one young chap who his behavioural trigger is red jumpers, but he actually attends a school where everybody wears red jumpers. So he has quite a difficult day. In his class, what they tend to do is that they all take the jumper off. They know he has difficulties around it, so he'll wear like they wear the polo shirt which is underneath that happens to be blue. So I think if there's always solutions. I just think you have to sometimes be the policeman to try to get to some of these. But the sound of fans. Like I can hear this fan here. There are fans in classrooms, aren't there? Because there are fans on the overhead projectors, that kind of thing. And allowances for processing. If you ask a question, keep it shorter and allow time for that individual to process it. Because if all that's going on and you have a visual hypersensitivity and you have a tactile sensitivity, and you can hear the lighting, and you can hear the lights, the motors, you've got a disturbance from the window where the bright lights are coming in, and you've been asked to answer something, and all of a sudden everything kicks into an overload. I mean, one person said to me one time about, because I refer to sensory overloads almost like a bubble boil and melt, and I think when you get to the melt side of things, I liken that almost to an epileptic fit, in the sense that once the fit starts, it has to continue, it has to go through its duration. So when you get to sensory overload, I think it's best that the overload is allowed to take place. Very often, kids that are in a sensory overload, usually from teachers that don't understand, are still asked to comply when all they want to do is actually shut down. and that's when it's seen by teaching staff sometimes as being behaviour that challenges. Lunch times are actually a difficult area for children in mainstream school. Purely and simply because all of a sudden the whole place comes alive with noise. So if you have hypersensitivity to noise, or that is one of the triggers that you've worked out with an individual, instead of insisting or trying to do the right thing when you want to actually give them a social skill to try to join in and have lunch with people, it might be that they're actually trying to shut down. So if they actually want to eat their lunch in a quieter area, let them do it. Because very often kids with any of these difficulties might actually, in the event that there are no strategies put in place to help them, they will actually develop their own. And they're not always necessarily the best ones, but they are the ones that actually suit the individual at the time. And I think a classic one is that I've got a little project going at the minute with a few schools where I've asked them to, for people that have any sensory difficulties, I've asked them to actually, or allowed them to film, obviously with permission we've got, but to film for 1 minute exactly the experiences that they find difficult in their day, or the most difficult in their day. And the following one is from a young girl.
This is my school at about 12:45, which is the start of lunchtime. As someone with autism and sensory issues, this is the part of the day I find the most difficult. This is the queue for the dining hall. There's no path to walk through at the side, and the noise is amplified a lot in the corridor. I can't process that level of noise, so after a little bit I just get completely overloaded, and I can't cope with standing in a corridor like that. This is coming out of assembly. Up to 800 people all tried to leave at once. I hate being jostled and feeling I have no personal space. Sometimes I want to lash out. It's always hard not to run away.
My friends.
I know.
See, what I liked about this particular one was that the young lady who did this one, yes, she has sensory difficulties, but she also doesn't make a lot of eye contact. And I don't know if you noticed, but throughout the video, the video was basically shot through her eyes. But it's quite interesting that although she had a camera there, I mean, the sounds played about with, obviously, but there was no actual eye contact with the individuals as well, which is, it actually got the message across, from my perspective, as quite a true one, in all honesty. The next slide basically is it's a little project that I've got going in a couple of local authorities, which involves I'm quite big on inclusion. I like the idea of people with autism being included, or people with disabilities being included in all sorts of things. And what I've tried to do is to introduce autism to in mainstream to their school peers. And one of the things that we've been working on is that there's a few people, young individuals that I know, that have found it quite difficult to talk about their autism as such, or the sensory difficulties that they actually experience. So what we've been doing is we've actually working through with these guys, and they actually, the individuals actually talk through the puppet, basically. They're able to disclose more about the sensory difficulties that they experience, and that it's quite a good way of doing things, really, because very often, more often than not, individuals with autism that share a classroom maybe with 29 other kind of neurotypical children. Those neurotypical children are always seem readily aware of the difficulties that the individual with autism already experiences. But I think sometimes it's nice to be able to do something like that through the puppets, because they realise that although they have difficulties in that area, they actually want to be like the other 29, especially the more able ones. So it's quite a good way of introducing like difficult areas around autism or sensory to the mainstream class. So it's quite interesting, that one. I'm looking forward to some of the results from that one. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is about it. So I finished a bit early. I've flown through, but I'm sorry. Thank you. Oh, we finished too early.